Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, today we're starting the last session of the ninth topic of the course titled Globalization and Its Many Worlds. So, in this session, we're going to continue looking at part two, the Cold War, and looking at alternative models of development, the ones that occurred or were implemented in the Global South, in regions that were termed as the Third World nations. We're going to look at some examples of how third world nations were implementing different types of systems from the first world capitalist system sponsored by the United States and the second world system sponsored by the Soviet Union. After we do that, we're going to move into part three to look at the rise of neoliberalism. This is really the rise of global capitalism. We're going to see the attempts of particularly international institutions to implement reforms particularly in third world countries, but also in communist countries, in order to change those countries and transform them into capitalist economies and capitalist societies. This gave rise to mass consumerism around the world, the emergence of a global market as well, and also a host of problems that global capitalism is going to bring about to the world. And we're going to assess those problems, the challenges of globalization at the end of this topic in part 4. Okay, so let us turn to our outline so we can start looking at the third world. And if you recall, at the end of session 2, we were looking at the Global South. Again, this is the region that was formerly colonized by European powers. And at the beginning of the 19th century, we're going to see some of those regions like Latin America moving towards independence. And in the 20th century, we're going to be also looking at other regions such as Africa and India, moving towards independence as well. We're going to see the birth of new nation states. And this, of course, posed a question to those nations as to what kind of economic system are they going to implement to achieve development, to achieve economic growth, in other words. And so at the height of the Cold War, there were mainly two options, capitalism or communism. But the third world, as we'll see, is going to implement variations, different kinds of systems that were not necessarily capitalist or purely communist. And this is what we're going to get to see here, in this session, starting again in this first segment. This is really the region that is undergoing change and rapid transformation. They were trying to catch up with the advanced societies to the north. Remember, this is the Global South. So we're not talking about East and West anymore. We're talking about North and South. So those are the southern nations of the globe are trying to catch up with the most advanced industrialized powers of the North. Okay, so let us look at some examples at how the newborn nations of the 20th century are trying to achieve modernization, are trying to achieve development. Let's look at India, for example. If you recall, we talked about the decolonization of India. We spent a great deal of that talking about decolonization, particularly in the previous topic. And it is really by 1947 that India finally achieves its independence after a long, long struggle that involved the creation, for example, of a internal colonial party. It was called the Indian Congress Party. And that really was the party that the educated elites and also some merchants as well and other political figures were in control of in order to challenge the British Empire and demand more and more representation at first and later on demanding full independence. And finally, again, they were granted independence by 1947. And with that, we see one of the leaders of this movement, Nehru, seizing control of India. Again, this really happened after the death of Mahatma Gandhi in 1947. and which really was the most important leader of the independence movement. But the other leader was Nehru, and he was really the leader of the working class, India's labor movement. And he was really behind the creation of a number of syndicates and labor unions across India and organizing them around the cause for independence. So again, he's really the kind of the second in command, so to speak, in India's independence movement, and now he becomes the leader of this newborn nation. So his vision for the future of India was one in which the state is going to play a key role in India's economic development. So he's not really adopting capitalism, because capitalism implies laissez-faire economics, no intervention by the state or minimum intervention, or communism, in which communism suggests total control of the economy by the state. Instead, he's choosing to implement what is called economic socialism, in which there will be private enterprise, and there will be significant, of course, private enterprise within India, but the economy at large is going to be directed by the state. Okay, this is a state-directed economic development. What that implied is that the state is going to start fostering, administering, owning, planning a significant number of industries. We see the emergence of state industries. So they're trying to industrialize, in other words, and the state is behind this process. It's not leaving this process entirely to the private sector. So the state is in control of this process. In order to protect the domestic industry, they're erecting also protective tariffs. Those are taxes on imports, in order to make the people of India buy the domestic product instead of buying the foreign product introduced either by the British or otherwise. Trying to really foster development and creating protectionist policies. Okay, they're also setting up a series of welfare programs, like a safety net, social safety net, to provide also governmental services to the population, to attend the problem of malnourishment, health, for example. So public health services, education, and the like are also directed by the state. So it is really the state that is pushing for this process of change and trying to catch up with the West by choosing a totally alternative system of development. Despite those efforts, which, by the way, Nehru remains in power for about 4 decades in India. Okay, so he is the one pretty much in control of the country, and he is in command of the economy and trying to create a totally new system. And despite those efforts, still in India, what we see is the persistence of economic inequalities. Despite the efforts of the state to attend the problems of unemployment, poverty, malnutrition, for instance, education, health, and the like. Now, one of the reasons why this economic inequality persists has to do with the persistence of the caste system in India. Okay, the fact that still this ancient institution that really goes back millennia persists in the age of modernity, in which people are organized around certain lineage groups. A caste, in other words, is really a lineage group that are stacked in a pyramid from top to bottom. And of course, those at the very bottom are the laborers, they're called the Shudras, the laborers, the servants, including the peasants, a great many of them. And they are indeed exploited by all the other groups on top of the pyramid, all the other castes, in other words. Whether those are landowners and merchants and political administrators, religious figures, and the like. The upper elements of India's society still preserve their privileges of being the rulers of society, and they have access to the resources of the country, the best education, and also political leadership. Okay, so again, So despite the fact that there are efforts to implement a system to achieve economic development, again, we see the clash of traditional forms of social organization, social institutions that keep this very rigid hierarchy in which the vast majority of the masses are kept below the pyramid, unable to move upward. In other words, what is called social mobility. Okay, that is the problem that India faces in this case. Now, another region that also is trying to achieve economic development and modernization is Latin America. And as I mentioned, Latin America achieved its independence from Spain back in the 19th century, as early as 1821 and 1824, around those dates. And we see the host of new countries born in the 19th century, many of which were trying to achieve modernization, something that we looked at a previous topic, modernization in Latin America. Now, as we move into the 20th century, however, those countries are still on the path of modernization. A great many of them are still trying to catch up with the most advanced industrialized powers like the United States. That is a fact. And they are on this path of capitalist modernization, okay? Meaning that they have embraced the capitalist system and accepted the idea that it was necessary to invite foreign capital, particularly in the 19th century. We're talking about British, but towards the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries and onwards, we see now that most Latin American countries are opening their doors to Americans, something that we started looking at in this topic as well in the first session. So in the 20th century, clearly, Latin American republics are trying to modernize very rapidly, and they are indeed opening their doors far and wide to American corporations, to the point that, for example, when we look at the mid-20th century onwards, this region was not really changing much. Well, there is change taking place. Of course, there is infrastructure development, there are railroads, there are ports, roads, and the like, there are industries, and so on. But in terms of the standards of living, for example, in terms of wages in the country, in terms of the internal wealth that people are generating and enjoying for themselves, we don't see much change. It appears that Latin America continues to be in this kind of colonial status. I mean, they're not really colonized. They're not really treated necessarily as colonized societies necessarily, but their economies remain totally dependent from the outside, to the point that all their capital is being extracted out of their country. Now, it's almost like there's still a colony in that, remember during the colonial period, the mother country extracts resources, extract minerals, extract raw materials from a colony. Again, that is the purpose of a colony, to serve the mother country. And in return, the colony has to import everything that the mother country manufactures. So what we see in the 20th century is Latin America becoming a region that remains in a kind of neo-colonial condition. It's a new colonialism. Again, in that foreign powers, particularly British, the United States, again, are the main beneficiaries, again, of Latin American wealth. So, in what way, for example? Again, despite the fact that they're trying to achieve modernization, what we see is still that Latin America, a great number of Latin American countries, are dependent on foreign finance, for example, that they're borrowing heavily from foreign banks, mainly New York banks in this case, and that their industrialization is for the most part in the hands of foreigners as well. Again, this is something that we looked at in the past when we're looking, for example, at modernization in Russia, modernization in Mexico, modernization in China. That modernization was taking place by the infusion of foreign capital, and that industrialization remained in the hands of foreigners. So this is the situation that we see across the region. And also, this is a situation of neocolonialism, a new form of colonialism, because Latin American countries are totally geared to export their wealth to the outside. They have export-led economies for the most part. They export a host of agricultural products, crops, different kinds like sugar, coffee, for instance, palm oil, Henneken as well, a host of different products, and also raw materials. Again, raw materials. There's iron ore and coal, lumber, and the like. Again, so they are exporting those products into the outside, particularly to the core countries that are the ones bringing in the capital, bringing in the technologies into those regions to transform them. And they're also in a neocolonial status because it seems that, for the most part, they are providing also a cheap source of labor as well. That their labor is cheaper than the labor in the industrialized countries. So therefore, there's an incentive to bring in industries, let's say from the United States or otherwise, into Latin America, because that will ensure that those companies are going to gain maximum profits, again, by exporting cheap labor. Now, in return, those Latin American republics must also, for the most part, import manufactured goods. They had to also import the products that are manufactured, let's say, in the United States, okay, at a higher price. They have to export those products at a lower price, and they have to import manufactured goods at high prices as well. So it is because of this pattern that we see in Latin America that there will be some countries that are going to try to free themselves from that system and implement an alternative model of development. Okay, totally different from this neo-dependent, neo-colonial system that got consolidated in the 20th century. And I will just name a couple of examples, again, of Latin American countries that are really creating alternative models of development. For example, Mexico. Okay, Mexico, remember, we covered the Mexican Revolution in this class. And one of the issues of the Mexican Revolution was sovereignty. This idea that Mexico was for Mexicans. There was an alliance, a cross-class alliance in Mexico that brought together, members of the elite, the Mexican elite, with middle-class ranchers and farmers, along with peasants and workers at the bottom of society. The common denominator is that they wanted to expel, in this case, foreign investors, foreign merchants, industrialists, foreign companies from Mexico. Okay, so the Mexican Revolution was truly a nationalistic revolution. Okay, nationalistic first and foremost. Now, that also created problems later on. At some point during the revolution, those factions began to fight amongst themselves. Different classes, different factions began to fight over the course of Mexico's future. And although one of the factions, particularly the Mexican elite, along with the middle class, ended up seizing control of the state, it was not very easy to bring people together in Mexico. For many reasons, that, of course, they had opposition from the peasantry, which constituted the vast majority of the population, the industrial working class as well. And what we see is that the Mexican state was very, very unstable. That the new government of Mexico, the victors of the revolution, needed to integrate all sectors of Mexican society into the system. So the only way to build a nation, they said, the only way to keep it together, to create internal stability and achieve some kind of economic development was to integrate all classes of people, all sectors of society into the system. So again, what we see is the formation of a socialist economy, by necessity. Otherwise the country would have disintegrated. And this is done by the leadership of a single party. Again, so we're looking at the development of a one-party state, the Party of the Revolution. It was called the PRI, okay, the Party of Mexico's Revolution. And they're going to implement a socialist economy from 1938 to 1986. Again, this is when Mexico was really implementing a socialist economy, in which the party itself was in charge of the economy. It will allow, of course, private interest and private enterprise to carry out their activities inside of Mexico. Okay, giving preference to Mexican nationals, in other words, that the Mexican elite will have a greater participation in Mexico's economy. And although they will allow Americans and foreigners to participate, that they will be very restricted in terms of what resources they could buy, what industries they could operate, that Americans and other foreigners in Mexico will be kept at bay, in other words. That again, the private sector will continue to exist, but it will be placed in the hands of nationals. But there will be a significant number of different areas of the economy that the state is going to run. Yeah, just like India, for example. We looked at the state-run economy. Okay, so there will be, of course, a host of different sectors like healthcare. It will be provided to all people, to all Mexicans, free healthcare, for example. Energy, the energy sector, electricity, coal, and oil is also going to be nationalized. It's going to be in the hands of the state. Steel production, education will be free all the way to university as well. Free education and free textbooks as well. Agriculture is not going to be necessarily owned by the state. Land will be returned to the peasants. So we see the creation of collectives in Mexico. The peasantry is now gaining back the lands that they lost back in the 19th century. But the state is directing agricultural production. They're providing assistance like seed to the peasants. They're controlling prices. The state is the main buyer of Mexican grain and so on. So they are directing the agricultural sector. The peasants own the land, but the state controls the agricultural economy at large. Okay, telephone and a series of banks are also going to be owned by the state as well. Now, Mexico also wants to industrialize, and they're also, just like India, trying to foster domestic industrial development. And they're trying to limit imports. Okay, so they're trying to create a domestic industry, and they're involved in providing loans, financial assistance for the creation of different enterprises, particularly enterprises that can create products that Mexico had been importing in the past. This program was known as import substitution industrialization. That instead of importing an industrial product, instead the Mexican state is going to sponsor the formation of an industry that is going to manufacture that product as well. Okay, so little by little, every single commodity and product that Mexicans imported from without, we're going to see correspondingly inside of Mexico an industry, a factory, an industrial plant of sorts that is going to be manufacturing that. Okay. And in order to protect Mexican industry, the state is also erecting, protective tariffs, placing very high tariffs on imports. And again, it will just be very, very expensive to buy anything in Mexico, anything imported. And this really decentivized really the import of goods whatsoever, because it was just, again, astronomically high. Okay. Now, because of all those efforts to take charge of different sectors of the economy and trying to sponsor industrialization and such, protecting domestic industry. During the 1950s and 60s, the Mexican economy really boomed. This was known in Mexican history as the Mexican miracle. We see GDP growing significantly in the country. The standards of living are rising. The government is also providing housing to all people, to industrial workers, to bureaucrats. Anybody that was employed in Mexico had access to housing as well, and healthcare and education. So it seemed that this model was really working for Mexico, and we see, of course, a great change, great transformations taking place. Of course, we're going to see a host of different problems as we approach the 1970s and 80s. That is going to lead to a reversal of those policies, something we're going to get to see, particularly in part 3. Now, the other region of Latin America that is going to implement an alternative system of development is going to be Cuba. And just like Mexico, Cuba was also largely dominated economically, in this case, by foreigners. Okay, if you recall, we were talking about Cuba being a protectorate, a U.S. protectorate from 1903 to 1959. It was not a colony, again, it was not. But Cuba had opened its doors to American corporations to come in and invest and develop different industries and take charge of different sectors of the economy. Again, we see massive outpouring of finance, investment, and capital into the island by U.S. corporations, to the point that by 1959, U.S. corporations had invested in Cuba about $1 billion US. Okay, about 1 billion. They were running the sugar industry, also most of the sugar fields as well, the sugar mills, oil refineries were there as well, electricity, utility companies, telecommunications, telegraph, the telephone as well, and also banking as well. Okay, so this is the situation. Again, it's not really a colony, but rather that the economy is totally in the hands of foreigners during this time. Now, the problem in Cuba started out with the emergence of an individual, Fulgencio Batista, who controlled Cuba politically from 1934 to 1959. He was not really in power continuously year by year, but when he was not in power, he will appoint somebody that he controlled, in other words. Okay, so he was there to just keep the status quo, things as they are, in other words. And as such, Batista turned very corrupt over time, over the years. Okay, when a person remains in power for too long, that often happens. That his friends and his family members and so on, start really seizing control of certain resources of the state, and they live very lavish lifestyles and the like. Again, so there was scandals of corruption surrounding him, and that led to massive discontent, particularly among the poor. And indeed, there was massive poverty in Cuba. Massive. The peasantry, served as simply labor for the sugar plantations, and the industrial working class also served as just as a cheap source of labor for companies, for mills, and the like across the island. Again, so this provided the ripe soil, if you will, for revolutionary upheaval. And this is what we see the emergence, for example, of such an individual like Fidel Castro, who's going to be rallying, in this case, the disgruntled masses, in this case, again, of the island, and turning the masses against Batista. Okay, that was initially his idea, just to remove Batista from power and bring in a new system that he believed was going to address some of the problems that affected Cuban society. Again, the problem of healthcare, the problem of lower wages, for instance, the problem of malnutrition, illiteracy, and the like, a host of different problems. And so by 1959, Castro ousted Batista, and he's going to control the island all the way to the end of the 1990s. Again, so he'll really institute a dictatorship. Again, so this is a kind of system that mirrored, for example, the Soviet system, in that what we see is a kind of one-party state, just like the Soviet model, very similar to the Soviet model, because we see, of course, a one-party state in which the leader of the party is going to be in charge of the country and pretty much take control of every aspect of society and every aspect of the economy as well. Okay, so let's look at one by one what Castro and his revolution tried to implement in Cuba. Again, they're also trying to set up a kind of like a utopian system as well. Remember that during this time, nations are not just trying to achieve economic development for doing so, but rather they're trying to create an ideal society in which they believe this is going to provide the opportunities for people to find fulfillment and also human happiness. Again, whether we're talking about Mexico, whether we're talking about the United States, whether we're talking about India or the Soviet Union and the like, again, this is what societies in the 20th century are trying to achieve. So likewise, here, Castro kind of borrows elements from the Soviet model and believes that the only way to achieve this utopia is to have total control of the state, a kind of totalitarian, government in this case. This came in the form of a law that he introduced as soon as he seized power in Cuba. It's called the Fundamental Law of the Republic, in which he assumes total control. It's really the dictatorship. There will be no National Assembly or Congress that will be legislating or sharing power with him, but rather he's going to be ruling by decree, in other words, okay, the island. Number two, in his vision for Cuba in the future is one in which foreign presence of companies and corporations are going to cease to exist. He's going to be nationalizing oil refineries, factories, sugar mills, utility companies, including banks, and he's going to be driving foreign interests, foreign companies out of the island. Again, he's going to be, of course, in this case, affecting directly American interest. Okay, there will be certain companies that will be also affected by this process, affecting the property, for example, of Coca-Cola, Sears, Roebuck, and other companies. Again, will be also affected by this nationalization reform that he's bringing about. Okay. Now, in response, during this time, the United States is going to place an embargo on the island, stop all trade, in other words, with Cuba. So obviously, this is going to lead to a falling out, so to speak, a rupture between U.S. and Cuba's relationships that had been in place all the way back to 1903. And instead, what Castro is going to do is seek the assistance of the Soviet Union, seek financial and also military assistance of the Soviet Union, and in doing so, kind of tying the Cuban economy and the Cuban model to the Soviet model as well. Okay, so again, this is in the 1960s, leading to a crisis, the crisis of the Cold War, when the Soviet system is now moving into Latin America itself. So it was not just Eastern Europe anymore. Remember, this is the Cold War, and communism appeared to be now advancing into the Western Hemisphere proper. So this is going to intensify, the anxieties, the fears here in the United States concerning the spread of communism, because it was now 90 miles away, from home, from Florida. All right, so Other reforms he implemented was the confiscation of lands from the large landowners. There were, of course, very wealthy landowners in Cuba that were running what is called a latifundio or latifundia. Latifundia is a large landed estate. Those were the wealthiest plantation owners, in other words, the latifundio. He's going to eliminate the latifundio, this large landed estate, seize their lands, and also the lands of farmers who own kind of medium-sized properties as well. So, the idea was to also reform the agricultural sector by placing more and more lands in the hands of the peasants. But once again, this is a state-controlled, state-planned economy in which the state is going to play a key role, a central role in the economy at large, particularly in agriculture. So what we see is the formation also of state-owned farms. About 70%, again, of all the farmlands of Cuba were in the hands of the state, and only 30% remain in the hands of the peasantry. So the state is really directing this process. This is truly a communist system, akin to the one that we see, for example, in the Soviet Union, with the collectivization of lands that we looked at in session 2. Very, very similar. Another area where the system is going to play a key role, the state, is in the world of health and education. Again, so public health is going to be state-owned, state-run and directed, and also education. So to providing pretty much free healthcare to all the people of Cuba, and also free education. So again, what we see is a Latin American region, a Latin American country that is also breaking away from the mold, so to speak, and trying to create their own. They're borrowing certain elements, in this case the Cuban experiment, in this case from the Soviet model, but nonetheless, again, it is really an attempt to develop an economy from a status in which there was clearly stagnation and no development whatsoever. Okay, now, in South America, what we see is going to be a kind of reversal or reaction against this process. That what we saw, for example, in Mexico and Cuba, we're going to see a total reversal of that, a counter-revolution, in other words. For example, in Guatemala, again, we see the rise of authoritarian regimes that are trying to prevent change, trying to prevent, economic, socialism, or the intervention of the state in the economy in order to provide, the population with what they need, whether it is better wages or employment or health or education and the like. We see a total reversal of that starting in Guatemala. This is a region that was largely dominated by foreign companies like the United Fruit Company that was extracting coffee, sugar, cotton, again, from that country and pretty much dominating, virtually almost every area of Guatemala's economy. Utility companies, transportation systems, and the like. Banks, you name it. Now, in 1944, we're going to see a particularly disaffected middle class, along with bureaucrats, trying to bring change in Guatemala. A democratic change. They want a democratic system in which the interests and the wills of particularly middle class people are going to be represented in the state. They want democracy, in other words. So what we see is a movement. It's not really a bloody revolution. It's just a massive organization of different groups trying to bring about reform, moderate reform. They still want capitalist development. Okay, they're not really rejecting capitalism. What they want is really to stay on the track of capitalism, but they want, more participation by the middle class in the economy and also in the political system. Now, the peasantry was not really represented in this movement, and the peasants want their lands returned because, the fact is that foreign companies seized millions and millions of acres of land that belong to the peasantry. They're indigenous, they're Maya in this case. So there is a disaffected group that constitute the vast majority of Guatemala's society. And it is in 1952, with the election of Jacobo Arbenz, that we're going to see an individual now coming into power that is going to be paying attention to the peasants and trying to create significant change inside of Guatemala. That is not going to be moderate. He wants more radical reform. He wants to, first and foremost, nationalize the economy. In other words, look, just like what happened in Mexico, Mexico for Mexicans, well, Guatemala for Guatemalans, in other words. Okay, he's trying to limit or end the import of manufactured goods coming from particularly the United States by implementing what is called import substitution industrialization, trying to industrialize and create different industries, factories that will produce what the peoples of Guatemala required instead of importing it, that we're going to produce it, in other words. And then he tried to also implement agrarian reform, trying to seize the lands of the most important U.S. corporation in Guatemala, the United Fruit Company, seized millions of acres from this company in order to give it back to the peasants. And again, once he's doing this, he's going to be affecting, of course, perhaps the most critical foreign corporation in the country that exerted significant influence in the political order as well, and also back in the United States. And this is going to lead to a change, a political change in Guatemala. In 1954, what we see is that some elements within the Guatemalan army, some generals, are going to stage a coup and oust Arbenz from power. And what we see is the beginning of a military dictatorship from now on, in Guatemala, and a reversal of the policies that Arbenz tried to implement, the nationalization of the economy and bringing about agrarian reform. All of that is going to be halted, after the coup. And of course, Guatemala goes through a period of turmoil because now the peasants are going to be up in arms. In other words, demanding their lands, and there's going to be a clash between the state and the peasantry, from this point onward. So this led to massive political instability. In the Southern Cone, we see a similar process taking place, not identical, in which we see military juntas, or the joint chiefs of staff, in other words, of those national armies, now seizing power and instituting dictatorship as well to reverse any kind of revolutionary change. In the southern corner of South America, like in Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, and of course Chile is perhaps the best case study for understanding this counter-revolutionary trend in Latin America that is trying to prevent change. Again, this is a region that was also infused by foreign capital. We see massive American corporations like the Guggenheims, the Anaconda companies, mining empires, taking charge of the copper industries and the nitrates industries as well. And also a host of different U.S. companies, in charge of utilities like electricity, telephone, telegraph, banks, and the like. They were on the road, Chile, again, of capitalist modernization. But just like Guatemala and Mexico and all the other regions, we're going to see a movement brewing from below. There will be a host of different factions. Again, this is not really a unified group. There will be middle class, individuals. There will be perhaps some members of the elite within Chilean society. There will be bureaucrats. There will be workers and students. Again, a host of different, factions that wanted to bring about change, and socialism appeared to be quite compelling for the Chilean masses in terms of trying to move away from this capitalist development that created dependency and instead institute a more socialistic system. And we see, indeed, in 1970, a nationalistic upsurge. Remember, it is nationalistic. They're trying to oust foreign interest from Chile and implement a quite different system of development. And in 1970, we see the election of a candidate that represented this nationalistic / socialistic movement, Salvador Allende, elected into office to lead Chile, and he is trying to implement a socialist program, very akin to the one that we saw, for example, in Mexico, with the PRI, with the Revolutionary Party, for instance. Okay, trying to direct the economy and provide certain social services that will be universal, like housing, for example, to end homelessness and poverty, health, and also free education as well. Now, it is when he's trying to nationalize the foreign-owned mines, in this case, by Anaconda, for example, and the Guggenheim brothers, and so on, that he's going to affect directly, foreign interest. Very similar to what happened with Arbenz when he tried to nationalize some of the lands of the United Fruit Company. He's also confiscating the lands of the large landowners, many of whom were foreigners as well. So in 1973, just like what happened to Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, we see also a military coup, that ousted Allende from office. There are some elements within the military in Chile that believe that Allende was a Marxist, a communist, and that he was really trying to bring communism into Chile, and he's going to be ousted from power. And we see the implementation of a military dictatorship by a general, Augusto Pinochet, again, who's really going to rule the country with an iron fist. He's going to start crushing this nationalistic, socialistic upsurge in Chile. He uses terror as a tactic, in this case persecution and torture and so on, in order to quell this upsurge. And again, he's really trying to roll back the socialist policies and instead adopt a more free market economic system in which Chile will remain tied to the outside, totally dependent on foreign capital, and of course as a main supplier of raw materials and minerals to the outside and the like. Again, so we see a reversal, in Chile. We see also a reversal in Guatemala, but also reversals are happening across the southern cone, as I mentioned, in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and the like. Again, it's a similar process, again, that we're seeing military dictatorships and trying to prevent socialist reform. Now, part 3 is going to look at the rise of neoliberalism, and this is really an attempt to return to 19th century capitalism, 19th century laissez-faire economics. This is the attempt to spread capitalism around the world, to create a global economy in which this global economy is going to be a capitalist economy. Again, this is what neoliberalism, neoliberalism is. If you want to sum it up again in two words, is global capitalism, trying to implement global capitalism, starting around the 1970s onwards. And also the idea that in order to do that, what we need is to have leaders, the leaders of countries around the world, to be trained in economics. This is what is called scientific economics. To have people graduate from universities with economic degrees, with PhDs, that will be in charge of the nation's political system, but also the economic system, in order to reform it, in order to tie those countries into the global economy, to transform the country into a capitalist state, and then plug that country into this global capitalist network. Okay, that is the idea, okay, of neoliberalism. Again, although neoliberalism has no founder necessarily, it is really an American economist that gets the credit for promoting neoliberalism within the United States, but also around the world. His name was Milton Friedman. He was an American economist who taught at the University of Chicago, and he trained a number of students who ended up going into many regions of the world, particularly Latin America. And they ended up becoming presidents or advisors or senators, and they are going to be introducing reforms in many countries around the world, particularly, again, Latin America. So again, he's really the mover and shaker, if you will, of this emergent system. It's called neoliberalism, trying to promote a series of reforms that are going to be moving the world towards global capitalism. You know, this idea of privatization, that we need to privatize everything. You know, that the state should not own anything, in other words. That, you know, that the state should sell all their assets, all their industries, their resources, even their essential services to the private sector. That the economy should be in the hands of the private sectors. Again, this is the original doctrine of capitalism, again, that the private sector is the one directing the economy, in other words, not the state. And the state is left out, this laissez-faire, hands-off the economy. And so, number two, the state should be left out from regulating industry and big businesses. Again, that we should eliminate all kinds of regulations, because regulations place a lot of obstacles to economic development. You know, when you have so many rules to follow, you know, so many laws and so on, that limits the ability for people to invest in a country or to develop any kind of business. So you need to deregulate, in other words. Okay. Also, limit or eliminate state spending. Remember, getting the state out of the economy, meaning that the state should not be promoting any kind of welfare program or social services whatsoever. Again, so eliminate all kind of state spending is essential for Milton Friedman and the neoliberals, and also lowering taxes, meaning that instead of charging high taxes to the rich and the big corporations, that we should lower those taxes, you know, to kind of foster development. That is the idea. And also to sponsor free trade agreements, that nations should open their doors to foreign investment, to foreign capital, allowing foreign companies to come in and create jobs. So the idea is that we should pursue labor all over the world. And this is the idea. If you own a company or an industry or a corporation, that you should be free to enter any country and offer jobs to that country, again, in the pursuit, of course, of resources, in this case, cheap labor, in other words. One of the very first countries that adopted the neoliberal model were the United States and the UK in the 1980s. This became known simply as Reaganomics because of Ronald Reagan. He's the big reformer that implemented those neoliberal reforms I just mentioned. And Margaret Thatcher in the UK were the ones that were moving the UK, and Reagan in the United States were moving those countries away from welfare systems or welfare programs or a welfare economy into this neoliberal system in which the economy is now handed down to the private sector. And we see the elimination of many of the social programs, welfare programs, and the like again. So again, the US and the UK are really the pioneers of this change. And second, there will be other host of different regions like Latin America, for example. Latin America is going to also follow in this pattern of reform, trying to change the socialistic systems of Latin America into more capitalist systems that will be plugged into this global capitalist network. This occurred since 1982 as a result of a debt crisis in Latin America. You know, the fact is that many of the countries in Latin America had borrowed heavily from foreign banks, particularly American banks like Citibank, the Bank of America, JP Morgan, in order to foster development. And they acquire a large debt in the process. And in doing so, by 1982, this big bubble burst. Again, this big debt that had been accumulated for decades suddenly was unpayable, in other words. And they defaulted on those loans. And what we see is a banking committee coming in to try to reform, Latin American countries. It's a banking committee made up from many different delegates from the banking community, particularly the International Monetary Fund, that are going to provide emergency loans to the Latin American countries to continue making payments and not to destroy their economies. But the recommendation of the International Monetary Fund, along with Washington officials, this became known as the Washington Consensus, is that yes, we're going to keep the economies of Latin America afloat. We're going to provide extensions for repayments and so on, but we need change. In other words, your countries need to undergo structural reform, to solve the debt crisis. You need to end protectionist barriers, okay, end protectionism, in other words, allow more imports, in other words, without taxes. You need to privatize your state-owned industries. In fact, in order to compensate for some of that debt, you need to start selling your assets, like your electrical industry, like your oil industry, for example, mines, steel plants, ports, coastal areas. You need to start turning those assets to foreign investors and corporations, and then you can clear some of that debt. In other words, we can swap, in other words, the debt for assets in this case. And you also have to downsize the state. You have to cut down on social services, education, social security. You need to limit, again, the size of the state significantly in cutting down those services as well. So again, Latin America is now adopting the neoliberal model and is moving back to the kind of 19th century economic liberalism that we've just been discussing in this course. In India, we see a similar process. In 1991, although India is not really indebted like Latin America, it is really moving away from the economic socialism implemented by Nehru. And they're ending protectionism. They're trying to globalize their economy. They're trying to foster development by moving towards capitalism. So they're ending protectionism as well. They're allowing more imports into India without tariffs. They're reducing state industries by privatizing them, selling them to private investors, and so on. And their exports are going to increase about 700%. Again, 700% exports increase. So there is massive change taking place in India because of those changes. And that allowed for a technological revolution, particularly in digital systems, computer systems in India. So they're creating an industry of their own, and they're becoming one of the leaders in computer technology in the world. But still, at the end of the day, there's still acute disparities of wealth, within India. Again, despite the fact that they're moving now towards neoliberalism and they're becoming now integrated into this new global neoliberal economy. In China, we see something similar in that the attempts to create this ideal communistic peasant society in China through the Great Leap Forward that we talked about, 1958 onwards, failed. That led to a cultural revolution in the 1960s in China, in which people were trying to purge China from all westernizers, that we are not really achieving this utopia, this egalitarian society without hierarchies, because there's still within ourselves a lot of people that think like the West, in other words. So the Cultural Revolution was trying to purge people that were considered quote-unquote westernizers. That this is the reason why we cannot really achieve this egalitarian, non-hierarchical society. They went against, industrial elites. They went against educators, university professors, and the like, across China. So by 1976, Mao, the leader of this process, dies. And what we see is the arrival of a new leader who's going to be more of a kind of like a reformer, moving away from the ideas of the past of Mao, Deng Xiaoping. And he had in mind a modernization program for China. In other words, instead of moving backwards and trying to stay as a peasant society, he wanted to really revamp China and modernize, industrialize, in other words, and to a certain degree, why not even westernize it a bit, in other words. So he's going to move away from communism and instead adopt state capitalism, okay? So we implemented capitalism, but the state is going to be directing this process. There will be private enterprise in agriculture, in industry. We're going to allow the emergence of new industries. And of course, this is going to lead to the emergence of hierarchies. Okay, so inevitably he said we're going to have that, just like in the West. But the state is going to play more and more role in the economy. That is not going to be totally laissez-faire. This is not a laissez-faire economics. The state is pretty much still largely in control of the economy, the national economy. He's going to allow foreign investment in industries, creating economic zones for corporations. He's going to allow corporations to come into China and to be awarded certain regions where they can open up factories, industrial plants, and use, of course, the cheap labor of China. This meant that with the arrival of foreign corporations into China, workers and peasants are going to start losing ground. A great many peasants lost their lands because their lands are being privatized, and this is going to lead to a massive influx of peasants into the cities. Massive influx of peasants into the cities. So again, there's millions and millions of peasants now moving into the industrial centers, and we're going to see massive overcrowdedness in Chinese cities, and of course that led to, of course, pollution as well. Okay. In the Soviet Union, we also see neoliberalism being implemented, and this is going to end communism. This came as a result of a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who seized power in 1985 in the Soviet Union. And he's encountering, of course, a country with a slowing economy. It was stagnant. It was still trying to manage every aspect of the Soviet economy. It was too big to manage. And of course, great portions of Russian society are totally disaffected as well. They're being repressed and persecuted. They have to be totally loyal to the Communist Party. And of course, we see, persecution taking place in this totalitarian state. So people want reform. They want to try something new. Communism was perhaps something that was appealing to the previous generations, but, by the 1980s, people are now abandoning communism in this case. So Gorbachev is going to be a reformer. He's going to try to reform the political and the economic system. The political system was reformed by introducing a law called Glasnost, in which he's going to allow for more discussion of Western ideas, capitalism. He created something called the Congress of People's Deputies in 1988, allowing for local assemblies to take place. Instead of the Communist Party pretty much managing the entire country, he's now granting, again, certain provinces, certain localities, self-government, and free discussion of ideas as well under Glasnost. Perestroika was an economic reform to try to reform the structure of the Soviet economy to implement some elements of capitalism, like private ownership of businesses. So instead of the state owning everything, that state industries are going to be handed to the private sector, little by little, in other words. So we're going to see the emergence of a middle class and also a capitalist class as well. Now, the fall of communism comes as a result of the Soviets moving into Afghanistan in 1979. They're trying to keep in power a regime there that was very loyal to the Soviets. We see a Muslim insurgency. They send hundreds of thousands of troops, and the Soviets are unable, in this case, to put down, this insurgency, and this is going to drain their treasury, through and through. And the center of world communism began to collapse. The Soviet economy is now cracking, in other words, because they overextended themselves, in the imperial ventures, and also the economy was totally inefficient. Now, the European alliance of Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact, is also ending in 1989. Country after country in Eastern Europe are declaring independence from the Soviet Union. And what we see is that this empire is now cracking and crumbling by 1981. By 1991, the election of Boris Yeltsin, this new prime minister, he quits communism altogether, and he allows for the independence of all of those republics that are moving towards independence. Again, are the member states, client states of the Soviet Union that are moving towards independence. Boris Yeltsin pretty much grants them that independence. And with that, in 1991, we see the end of the Soviet Union and the end, of course, of communism. in world history. Now, in 1999, we see the arrival of a new leader, Vladimir Putin, who is going to start implementing the reforms, the structural reforms to implement capitalism in Russia. Now, there's no more Soviet Union. Now we see Russia, of course. So this is monopoly capitalism, because, Putin will become a dictator, and he's going to start selling the state-owned industries to bureaucrats. A great many of them were bureaucrats, members of the Russian state, are going to start seizing those assets, and we're going to see the emergence of a new Russian capitalist oligarchy. Yes, there is a private sector on the rise, but this private sector, again, are really previous functionaries and bureaucrats that are becoming now capitalist, and they're monopolizing all industries and all the wealth of the country. They dismantled the welfare system of the Soviet Union, and we see, of course, increased poverty, in Russia from this point onwards, of course. Now, we see, of course, a transition towards a global economy and culture. When we look at the 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century, a technological revolution is underway. They started out with space exploration back in the 1960s, landing in the moon and the like, sending satellites. That led to the digital age, communication systems, computers, satellites, the internet, cell phones, automation in industry, and also AI, artificial intelligence. So we're living totally in a new age now. Is the age of information. And this is really creating the sense of a global community, because more and more people are becoming interconnected through a system of computer networks, internet, cell phones, and the like. Again, so we're gaining, again, a sense of a global community. There's also transnational capital now. The industrialization of the global south. Corporations are moving to the south in pursuit of cheap labor. Places like Latin America, China, Southeast Asia. What we see is maquiladoras, for example, or assembly plants in which corporations move their factories into those regions in search for cheap labor. That they're going to assemble those products and now send those products to be sold in the industrialized countries. Those were part of the general purpose zones that China created, for example, those regional zones granted to transnational corporations to open up their industrial plants in order to use the cheap labor and export those products to the industrialized world. There also, you see the integration of certain economies like North America with the free trade zones, for example, NAFTA, the integration of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And there's a free trade agreement in which capital is moving back and forth, investment and so on, and corporations are able to move back and forth again to exploit resources and also labor as well. The significance here is that capital is moving, but really people are not. Borders remain pretty much closed, but corporations now have access to use the resources and the labor of other countries. Again, that is the significance. We also see global consumerism. Again, global consumerism and global, marketing as well. Consumerism is going global now. We see the rise of mass consumer culture. It is widening during this time. There are some goods that are really affordable, even to the industrial working class of the poorest countries as well. They can afford things like, for example, Coca-Cola, certain electronics as well. McDonald's is going global, Nikes, and so on. There are certain consumer goods that are becoming more and more affordable to all people, and this is really creating the sense that, look, this is the advent of a new culture. It's a global culture in which one of the common denominators binding all the peoples of the world together is the idea that we all consume. That we all consume because this is the way that we acquire happiness. This is the part of this advertisement that is taking place. Global advertisement is skyrocketing. Companies around the world are investing about $453 billion a year in just advertisement alone. And one of the key ideas that they advertise is that consumption is the key to human happiness, and this is how you also become popular. You can create a very popular identity for yourself. You can refashion yourself in any way by consuming those products, and this is how you can rebrand yourself as well to the world as well. Again, so this is becoming quite, again, a norm all over the world. Okay. Now, part 4 is going to look at, rather quickly, globalization and its discontents. And I'm going to focus particularly on the main problems of globalization. We have seen the effort to globalize the world, to globalize the economies of the world, to restructure them, to turn them more into capitalism, in other words. That is a fact. But this process of globalization, trying to create a global culture based on consumption, trying to create a global economy based on private ownership, again, of production, private ownership of assets, and the economy at large in the private sector with minimum state participation, particularly lowering social services, welfare programs, and the like. What this has led to is a host of different problems. Nonetheless, for example, I will talk about particularly 3. One is global poverty, and economic inequality. The fact is that neoliberalism, as one of the staunch critics of neoliberalism was Andre Guden-Frank, who was an economist and anthropologist, wrote about really the emergence of this global system and criticized it, saying that, look, countries around the world are not really going to develop because they're totally dependent on foreign capital. He's the father of dependency theory, for example. This idea that what we're really creating around the world with neoliberalism, this global capitalist system, is dependency. That countries that are trying to modernize and develop their economies are totally dependent on foreign capital, foreign technology, investment, and the like, and all their wealth is being exported out into the country. And they are only suppliers of raw materials, mineral resources, and cheap labor. So we don't see capital accumulation inside of those countries. This dependency is creating conditions for underdevelopment. Why many countries around the world are lagging behind, why we see some countries very rich and the vast majority of the countries very poor, because the poor countries are totally dependent on the rich countries. In other words, for investment, capital, technologies, and the like, and they're just supplying wealth to the rich countries, in other words. Again, so they're remaining in poverty. And what we see is massive wealth inequality around the world. Just keep that in mind, that the top 10% of most societies around the world own anywhere between 60 to 90% of the wealth. The top 10% own 60 to 90% of the wealth in most societies around the world. The middle 40% owns anywhere between 5 to 35%, depending on what country we're talking about. But the bottom 50% of the world population earns less than 5% of the world's wealth. Okay, the bottom 50 of the world's population have less than 5% of the entire wealth of the world. That means that 50% of the world population survives with less than $2 a day. Less than $2 a day. 50% of the world population, that is to say. And they're largely concentrated in places like India, China, Southeast Asia, in Africa. And this is, again, perhaps the main reason why we see massive migrations from the south to the north. Southern countries are trying to send people up into the north because of that poverty, in other words. So this is, again, leading to mass migrations from the global south to the north in this case. Okay, we see also environmental pollution. Industrialization around the world has led to, again, issues such as, for example, consumer waste. Consumerism implies buying products and then discarding them. So we see, of course, large piles of waste and garbage thrown into the sea, the rivers, buried underground, etc. We see also nitrogen fertilizer being an issue. Is being synthesized now, is being produced in chemical plants in order to nourish the agricultural farms around the world. We're supplying fertilizer, but this fertilizer can be toxic, particularly when it rains and it moves into the rivers and into the sea. It kills also, sea life as well. So this is becoming also an issue. Fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels, CO2, producing carbon dioxide, has led to an increase of carbon particles in the atmosphere in the world. 400 units are now permeating the entire globe. And it was considered by climatologists that 350 particles per million were considered the maximum that we can reach, in other words. But now we have surpassed that, and we're pretty much reaching already 400 particles per million or carbon particles, again, in the atmosphere. Compounded this problem by deforestation. This has led to global warming and also natural catastrophes around the world because of environmental pollution. So again, poverty, number one. Second problem of globalization is pollution due to the problems that I just discussed. And the third is war and violence. Now, the fact is that now we're living in a high-tech world with a very advanced military weaponry. There are a number of nations that are possessed those kinds of those weapons, very advanced, very sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. And because of the intense competitive nature of our system today, nations are competing for energy and vital resources because this is a competitive system. It's capitalism. So in capitalism, we see competition for fuel, oil, coal, water, for example, land and food. And that leads often to warfare between countries, between groups, between societies, and so on. Africa and the Middle East are perhaps right now the focal point of those struggles, but they're by any means, again, the only ones, okay, of those kinds of struggles. Global migrations are also a byproduct of war and violence. There's a lot of people that are dispossessed, from their lands because of warfare, and they're forced to migrate. So we have also a refugee crisis in the world today. Again, those are actually peoples that have, suffered devastation, and they're forced to migrate into other countries, and they're treated as refugees. And because of the presence of refugees in a number of countries, particularly Middle Eastern refugees in European countries particularly, this has led to the rise of far-right movements. Those are movements that are very nationalistic, and they're trying to expel immigrants, expel refugees, and they're trying to militarize their borders. This is the trend today. And this is one of the outgrowths, again, of this trend towards violence and warfare that I just mentioned a moment ago. That's led to refugee crises and, of course, the rise of very far-right nationalistic movements that are trying to expel the foreigners and militarize their borders. Now, last but not least, this climate of warfare and violence has also led to a number of religious phenomena on the rise. For example, these ideas of end times fundamentalist outburst. This sense that perhaps we're living in an end times today. There's a number of people that go back to religious scriptures and prophecies in Bibles, for example, and so on, in which they tell about the end of the world. There's cataclysm, there's warfare, Armageddon, and so on, the war of nations. And they believe that what we're actually experiencing, this disintegration of the world, pollution, that we're seeing poverty, warfare, etc., that this is really the sign of an ending world. And this has led to fundamentalist outbursts in which people join a fundamentalist religion in order to fight, for example, who they believe to be their enemy, for example. That's one way. But there's also, again, other people that join millenarian movements in which they foresee the coming of a new age. That perhaps what we're really looking at is the disintegration of the old world and the beginning of a new world, a renewed earth, a new humanity, a new time that is going to be ideal. So for this ideal time to come into being, the old world has to disintegrate, in other words. This again has led to something called the New Age movement. We're actually experiencing that today, the revival of old religious traditions, seeing that there will be a new earth in the future, a new spirituality, a new spiritual human that will be more conscious or super conscious in that regard. And this was best expressed in a movement centered around the end of the Mayan calendar in 2012, that really became a global millenarian movement in which people believed that the end of the Mayan calendar in 2012 foretold the arrival of this new age, a new spiritual conscience age in which humanity was going to grow out of the old patterns of thought and behavior that kept humans in fear, for example, and in separation and fighting each other and the like, that we're moving into a new time. All right. So the summary points so far, we have looked at globalization, this phenomenon, this trend that emerged in the 20th century to integrate the world's economies and create also a sense of a global culture as well. One of the very first pioneers in this regard, trying to promote economic integration and the creation of a global culture, was the United States with its American mission. This American mission started out in Latin America, trying to spread American cultural ideas and values. We talked about that. Capitalism, individualism, for example, consumerism in Latin America became like an experiment. And the Cold War is going to globalize this process as the United States was trying to spread the American system around the world, but with competition, that there will be competing worldviews. The Soviet Union, China, third world countries were trying to create their own utopias, their own ideal societies, and trying to remake humanity in their country, if you will. And we see competing models of development, again, throughout the Cold War. It's really in the 1970s and 80s that we see the attempt to globalize the economy at large by implementing a capitalist system around the world. This was known as neoliberalism. Again, it was global capitalism. To globalize the U.S. system in this case, we saw that in places like China, Russia, India, Latin America, and that brought, of course, a new technological era, the computer age, the digital age, for example, global consumerism, and also, of course, transnational corporations moving their industries, their factories, industrial plants around the world in the pursuit of cheap labor. Of course, that led to crises. Globalization is in crisis today as a result of poverty, pollution, and war. Those are the main problems of today that affects the civilizations around the world. So with this, we have concluded our discussion of world civilizations since 1500. This is the end of this course. This is all I have for you. Thank you.